Chapter 3, The English Colonies. Section 4, Life in the English Colonies. Each English colony had its own government, which was given power by a charter. The king issued the charter, and then whoever had their own charters would determine who controls the government. The English monarch, meaning the king or queen, had the ultimate authority over the colonies. The governor served as the head of the government and assisted by an advisory council. Some colonies had elected representatives. Obviously, Virginia will be the first colony to establish a legislature, that means a government, in 1619. It became known as the House of Burgesses. The town meeting was the center of life in New England political life. So a town meeting was basically all the citizens would come and discuss issues. The colonial courts reflected the beliefs of their communities, and they were used to control local affairs. Now, King James II saw how the colonies were running, and I think he was feeling, I don't know, maybe a little left out. So he wanted more control over the English government, including the colonies. So he took all the New England colonies, that would be Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire eventually when they're formed, and unite all those colonies under one government, and it was called the Dominion of New England in 1686. That was an attempt by him to control the colonies. Now, if you remember anything about the English history, the English had a form of government called Parliament. They were really the ones in control, not so much the king, but Parliament kind of worked together with the king. Parliament did not like James II, and so they will replace him, if you will. And they will pass something called the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This was a form of representative government, meaning that Parliament and the king would work more together than under James II, of course. The colonies in the Dominion formed new assemblies and charters, and they reformed their borders, and they could elect their own representatives. So it was back to being just Massachusetts and just Connecticut and just Rhode Island and just New Hampshire. Earning money from trade was one of the reasons why the British, or the English I should say, founded and controlled the colonies. That was one of the main reasons, because they wanted to earn money from the resources. England practiced something called mercantilism, a system of creating and maintaining wealth through controlled trade. So that means that England is controlling what the colonies trade to other places. So if you kind of look at this map here, you have sugar and cotton and tobacco going over to England. England will then take that and send stuff over to Africa, and then from Africa go slaves to the Americas. England is controlling that trade. That's mercantilism. Parliament is going to pass several different laws to try to control this trade. One of them is the Navigation Acts. It was to limit colonial trade. Basically, the colonists could only trade with England. And England will then will send things to different places. The colonies, of course, complained about the trade restrictions because they want to trade with lots of places. They felt like if they could only trade with England, they would not get the money that they thought they needed or earned. So this is the whole idea of triangular trade. So the colonists are sending all their goods over to England, so the sugar, cotton, tobacco, and then the British are trading their textile, rum, and manufactured goods down to Africa. And from Africa, you get slaves, and they send them over to the Americas. Again, I'll stress this again, that's what England wanted to do. They wanted to control trade through the triangular trade. The slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas on a voyage called the Middle Passage. Of course, there were terrible conditions on the Middle Passage, and it caused thousands of captives to die on the slave ships, whether that was disease spreading through there or just the brutal treatment by the slave traders on the ship, or just the cramped conditions that they were in. But you can see from this diagram of a slave ship, like the hundreds and hundreds of slaves that were boarded on these ships, probably way over the capacity that a ship was supposed to have. A religious movement began in the colonies called the Great Awakening. This movement swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, and that changed the whole idea of religion. You will start to see the beginnings of things called revivals. Revivals became popular places to talk about political and social issues. So it wasn't just a religious movement, but you could talk about politics and you could talk about social issues. George Whitehead was one of the key ministers of the Great Awakening spiritual or revivals. I want to stress the point that you could talk political and social issues here. This is really where you start seeing colonists start talking about possible independence from Great Britain, because you can talk at these revivals about how unhappy you were that your trade was being restricted. So this is kind of the seed that was planted for the independence movement. Another movement that began, it started actually over in Europe but then headed over to America, is called the Enlightenment. It was a movement in the 1700s that spread the idea that reason could improve society and formed ideas on how government should work. The movement said that people had natural rights. This is a very important point here, the natural rights idea, such as equality and liberty, which influenced colonial leaders. This guy here is a guy named John Locke. He was one of the most influential men of the Enlightenment period. Again, this is another important movement because, again, it gave colonial leaders the ideas of what a government should be, and they weren't really happy with the English government. We're going to talk about the French and Indian War, but prior to the French and Indian War, there was a smaller war between the English colonists and a guy who they eventually called King Philip. It was his English name. Of course, the English settlers were invading Native American lands. Indians weren't happy with that, and so you will see skirmishes throughout this early part of our history over that issue. And King Philip didn't like the fact that Americans or English were coming onto their land, so a little war broke out called King Philip's War. But you will see some Native American tribes aligning themselves with the English instead of fighting with King Philip. The French traded and allied themselves with some Native American tribes called the Algonquin and Huron Indians, and the English will ally themselves with the Iroquois. Now, the French and British have been struggling for a while over control over some of the lands in North America, and they really struggled for control of the West, meaning right along the past the Appalachian Mountains, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. This was in the late 1600s. Now, the English wanted to put forts out west. The French had already started kind of doing that. And so the English were told, a young man named George Washington, to go establish a fort out in the Ohio Valley to kind of control that area. Well, when George Washington got out into that land, it was already occupied by the French. They had already built a fort there. So George Washington told them to leave. And they said no. So George Washington will quickly put together his own little makeshift fort called Fort Necessity. And a battle will ensue. The British were going to attack the fort that was already out there by the French. And so the British, we're going to start calling them British now instead of English. And the British were wearing red coats, and they're walking through the woods, and they're walking in a straight line, and they're using drum beats to signal, to talk to them essentially. That's communication in warfare with drums. So they're walking a straight line through the woods, and what the British didn't know, waiting for them and behind trees and up in trees, were the French and some of their Indian allies. And they started to shoot at the British who were wearing the red coats, which made easy targets. And the French really dealt the first blows of what we will know as the French and Indian War. It starts in 1754. And we call it the French and Indian War because it was the British fighting the French and their Indian allies. So lots of battles will happen during this war, but the most important one will be the Battle of Quebec. Quebec kind of laid on top of a flat plains area, on top of a plateau, if you will. You can kind of see that in this picture here. And so the French were located up at the top, and what the British decided to do is, in the middle of the night, scale the walls, or the cliffs, if you will, and once daybreak would hit, they would be on top. This was called the Plains of Abraham, by the way. They would be up there waiting when the French awoke. And that's exactly what happened. The British climbed the hills and got to the top on the Plains of Abraham. They were ready for the French. When the French commander woke up, he saw the British out there, and that was not good. And so the Battle of Quebec began, and the British will defeat the French on this battle in 1759. That was kind of the turning point of the war for the British. And you will see the British winning this war after Quebec. The peace treaty that ended the French and Indian War was called the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And all the French lands that they had in North America, from all the way up in Canada down the Mississippi River, all of that land went to the British as their spoils for winning. So here are the original 13 colonies. This was all France up here and down the Mississippi River here. All this was given to the English, or the British, as their prize for winning the war. Now that the English colonists have won the war and they have more land now to go to, colonial settlers start to begin moving westward from the Atlantic coast past the Appalachian Mountains. That started to cause problems again with Native Americans. Native Americans, led by a guy named Chief Pontiac, rebelled against these new British settlements in 1763. That should be an I right there, not just an N, an I. Anyway, Pontiac will help to capture Fort Detroit, which is up in the Michigan area, if you're looking at that map right there. But eventually, Chief Pontiac will be defeated. Now, King George III, who's the new King of England, he isn't really happy with all this conflict between the Native Americans and his colonists. So, to avoid any more conflicts, King George III will issue something called the Proclamation of 1763. This banned any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So if we're looking at our map here, this is the Appalachian Mountains right here. So he banned any settlement west of that. So he said no British colony should be over in this area. That's another thing that the colonists will not be happy about, because they want to move out west to colonize, and the king will not let them. So that's just one more thing that they're angry about. The Navigation Acts, and now this Proclamation of 1763. That is the end of Section 4.